In May of 1945, the fall of Berlin did not mean security or peace. For thousands of women, the end of the war opened a new hell. The defeat of the Reich was mixed with a collective punishment that unleashed abuses of a magnitude difficult to conceal. The ruined streets and the underground shelters turned into scenes of permanent fear. There was no protection, there was no authority. What happened in those weeks left marks that survived entire generations and were rarely acknowledged in the official memory of the war. How far did the violence go when there was no longer an army to defend them? What do the medical records reveal about the suffering concealed for decades? Why is this chapter still ignored in the official memory of the war? Berlin in agony, the city of women. In April of 1945, Berlin had ceased to function as a capital. After years of unrelenting bombings, the urban surface was devastated. More than half of the buildings had severe damage and entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble that blocked the main arteries, forcing the population to move through improvised paths among ruins. The still active administrative records showed that the majority of the houses had suffered some kind of destruction. A considerable proportion was completely uninhabitable. The water and electricity supply had collapsed, with pipes burst under mountains of debris and power plants destroyed. The sewage system remained blocked, saturated with debris and bodies. The city, which had become a center of political and cultural power, was plunged into a total health crisis. In the outlying neighborhoods, waste collection had disappeared. The streets accumulated refuse that decomposed in the open air, attracting rats and flies. In areas like Prenzlauer Berg and Neukölln, the deteriorated sanitary conditions facilitated the appearance of dysentery and typhus. The population improvised latrines in parks and empty lots, while inner courtyards were transformed into sources of contamination. Hunger dominated daily life. Official rations had been reduced to a level insufficient to sustain the population. The food records kept in Potsdam confirm that grain reserves were at historic lows at the beginning of the spring. Poor quality black bread, spoiled turnips, fermented cabbage, and small pieces of horse meat made up the usual diet. The children showed clear signs of malnutrition, bowed legs, swollen bellies, and a sickly appearance visible in the shelters. The queues in front of the distribution centers were endless. Women and the elderly remained for hours in the rain or cold to return home without obtaining food. In the less monitored areas, the population began to hunt domestic animals and urban birds. In a few weeks, dogs, cats, and pigeons disappeared from the streets. The black market offered food at exorbitant prices. Watches, coats, and family jewelry were exchanged for small portions of potatoes or rancid butter. The hospitals could hardly function. The charity complex, the largest in the city, had lost several of its pavilions under the bombings. The standing sections lacked heating and electricity. The operating rooms depended on unreliable portable generators. On numerous occasions, the surgeons were forced to operate with flashlights or candles. The shortage of anesthesia turned each procedure into unbearable suffering. The lack of medical staff worsened the crisis. Many professionals had fled or had been sent to the front. Medical students and inexperienced aides were taking care of hundreds of wounded. The destroyed ambulances forced patients to be transported in wheelbarrows, bicycles, or on shoulders. Basements of ruined buildings were transformed into improvised hospitals. The composition of the population had changed drastically. The previous censuses recorded almost 3 million inhabitants. By April, more than 1 million had fled or died. The majority of those who remained were women, children, and the elderly. The men of military age were at the Eastern Front in prisoner camps or had fallen in combat. The few who remained were mobilized in the Volkssturm, civilian militias formed by teenagers and older men armed with obsolete rifles and hand grenades. The absence of men had turned Berlin into a city dominated by women. They bore the burden of survival. Mothers cared for malnourished babies in unheated shelters. Teenagers searched for food among the rubble while carrying younger siblings. Older women exchanged the little they had left for basic medicines. Underground shelters were the only defense against attacks. Since 1943, the population had become accustomed to descending each night to basements and subway stations. In recent months, these spaces were crowded to extreme levels. Civil defense reports speak of more than 100 people crammed into small spaces without ventilation. The air became unbreathable and excrement accumulated in metal buckets that were barely emptied. In some shelters, children and the elderly died of suffocation. In the subway, thousands of families lived in dark tunnels between abandoned tracks. Improvised mattresses, dirty water, and minimal reserves of hard bread made up the day-to-day. The stench of unwashed bodies and food scraps permeated the environment. The trains had stopped running, and the platforms were transformed into permanent camps. The problem of uncollected cadavers became an everyday occurrence. The cleaning brigades had stopped functioning, and the bodies remained for entire days in the streets, swelling under the sun and spreading a nauseating smell. In some neighborhoods, residents dug mass graves in parks and vacant lots to bury bombing victims. The bodies were covered with lime, but the stench persisted. Rats proliferated and the risk of epidemics increased. The collective morale was at the limit. There were testimonies circulating from refugees who recounted what had happened in East Prussia and Silesia after the arrival of the Red Army: murders, executions, and abuses against the civilian population. Although some doubted these stories, the majority feared they were true. The official propaganda continued to broadcast messages of resistance and victory, but in the city almost no one believed in those proclamations. The Nazi leaders maintained a rhetoric of total struggle. Goebbels called on the radio to resist until the end, which in practice meant mobilizing women and the elderly with improvised weapons against a much larger army. Many young people tried to flee to avoid being recruited, leaving their families unprotected. The regime itself constituted a danger to civilians. The Gestapo and the SS continued executing deserters and those who expressed doubts about victory. In the final days, dozens of Berliners were hung on lampposts with accusatory signs. These acts of repression sought to impose discipline but only increased the sense of hopelessness. The schools were closed, although some teachers continued to gather small groups of students in basements. The nights passed in complete darkness, illuminated only by the fires caused by the bombings. Families listened to the roar of the planes and distinguished the different types of bombs by the sound of their fall. Communications had been interrupted. The telephone lines were not working, the mail had disappeared, and the radio only broadcast propagandistic messages. The real information arrived through rumors, refugees, or the roar of the front that came closer every day. On the 16th of April, the final Soviet offensive had begun on the Silo Heights to the east of the city. 2 weeks later, the Soviet artillery was already striking the suburbs. The roar of the guns was audible in all districts. Berlin was completely encircled, with no escape routes to the west. The population understood that defeat was inevitable and that occupation was approaching quickly, although they still did not know the concrete forms it would take. The final assault, from war to occupation. On the 16th of April of 1945, the heights of Silo became the setting of the decisive offensive of the Red Army. Early in the morning, an unprecedented artillery concentration opened fire on the German positions. Thousands of cannons, mortars, and rocket launchers fired simultaneously for hours, creating a front of destruction that extended over tens of kilometers. The impact of that bombardment was so intense that the roar reached Berlin itself, located a considerable distance from the place of the battle. The German defensive positions were occupied by remnants of exhausted divisions, improvised units of the Volkssturm, and inexperienced young recruits. They had some armored vehicles of the most advanced models, but they lacked sufficient fuel and ammunition. Most were fighting from hastily dug trenches in waterlogged terrain, with old rifles and hand grenades. The contrast with the Soviet artillery power made it clear that those defenses would not hold for long. After several days of fighting around the Oder River, the Soviet formations under the command of Zhukov and Konev managed to penetrate the enemy lines. On the 21st of April, the first armored columns reached the eastern suburbs of the German capital. From then on, Soviet artillery and tanks began to be felt within the city, which turned into an urban battlefield. The advance towards the center was carried out with specific tactics for warfare in cities. Each street, each intersection, and each building became a military objective. The German defenders, formed by remnants of the Wehrmacht, units of the Waffen-SS, and local militias, used the rubble as fortifications. Barricades were erected with cobblestones and debris from demolished buildings, bridges were blown up, and apartments were turned into fortified positions with snipers on the upper floors and light pieces in basements. The battle was of extreme attrition. Snipers fired from semi-ruined windows, while Panzerfaust teams attacked Soviet tanks at close range. These attacks were met with massive firepower that razed the German positions. The Red Army, aware of the difficulty of advancing, adopted tactics that included intensive bombings, the use of incendiary rockets, and the employment of flamethrowers in cleanup operations. The order was to leave no point of resistance behind. The result was the almost complete destruction of each neighborhood before continuing the advance. The Reichstag became the symbolic target of the offensive. Although for more than 1 decade the building had not served parliamentary functions, its propaganda value was undeniable. The assault began at the end of April with fierce resistance inside. Elements of the SS, Kriegsmarine sailors, police officers, and groups of young people fought for 3 days in rooms and corridors. The Soviets advanced room by room using hand grenades and submachine gun bursts. On the 30th of April, a red flag was raised on the building's roof. Although the fighting did not stop immediately, that image became an international symbol of the collapse of the Nazi regime. While the main operations were concentrated in the city center, the occupation of the outlying neighborhoods was marked by looting and violence against the population. As soon as a Soviet unit was installed in a sector, there were break-ins in homes, shelters, and basements. Watches, bicycles, clothing, and food were systematically requisitioned. Wristwatches accumulated on the soldiers' arms as visible spoils. Bicycles were snatched regardless of to whom they belonged, and civilians' resistance was met with beatings or immediate executions. In some districts, after emptying the homes, entire buildings were set on fire. Whole families were forcibly evicted and forced to seek refuge in ruins or in already overcrowded communal basements. The metro stations and underground shelters, which had served as protection against bombings, became scenes of violence. Soldiers forced the entrances, searched the men for uniforms, and summarily executed those found with military clothing, without checking if they were active soldiers or simply civilians. They would then separate the women and commit sexual abuses on the spot or in nearby areas. A hospital in Prenzlauer Berg recorded the arrival of teenagers with serious injuries after being attacked in shelters. In at least one documented case, the victim died the next day due to internal bleeding. These incidents multiplied in different neighborhoods, repeating a pattern of violence in each occupied area. The artillery fire continued to cause a high number of civilian casualties. The shells struck residential buildings indiscriminately of military targets. In Moabit, entire shelters collapsed under the bombardments, burying alive hundreds of people. In Wedding, neighbors attempted to rescue bodies from the rubble using only their hands, while the fire continued in the vicinity. For days, corpses remained exposed in streets and courtyards due to the impossibility of recovering them under the constant fire. Summary executions were repeated in various parts of the city. In Karlshorst, to the southeast, there were shootings of men found with Wehrmacht jackets or helmets, although in many cases they were civilian officials. In other areas, elderly people were shot for trying to defend their homes. In Weissensee, a woman and her daughter were killed after trying to hide in the basement of their house. The collective shelters, which the population considered their only protection, turned into spaces of risk. In Charlottenburg, witnesses recounted how soldiers burst into a shelter with more than 200 people. After searching and beating the men, they took out several young women and assaulted them outside while the rest remained threatened with weapons. In Neukölln and Friedrichshain, similar situations were documented, where the massive presence of overcrowded families facilitated violence against the most vulnerable. The dynamics of combat and occupation were repeated in each district: bombing, house-to-house fighting, looting, and violence against the population. For civilians, there was no safe place. The ruins that appeared to serve as shelters became traps, and underground shelters no longer guaranteed protection. On the 2nd of May, after weeks of siege, the organized resistance collapsed. General Weidling, in command of the last defending forces, signed the unconditional surrender. Berlin was left transformed into an expanse of smoldering ruins. The combination of urban combat, executions, looting, and systematic violence had transformed the city into a space dominated by destruction and military occupation, with the civilian population trapped in a situation of absolute defenselessness. Planned revenge, Soviet hatred as a weapon. The Red Army that crossed the German borders in 1945 did so filled with resentment accumulated after 4 years of combat on the Eastern Front. The German invasion that began in June of 1941 was not a conventional campaign, but a war conceived from the start as a process of extermination. The directives of the Nazi High Command established that what they defined as the Bolshevik and Jewish enemy had to be annihilated, and that vision translated into policies of systematic violence against millions of Soviet civilians. The siege of Leningrad lasted for almost 3 years, with a population that survived extreme winters under constant bombardment and an almost total lack of food. Soviet records confirm that daily thousands of people died of hunger or cold in a city turned into a symbol of resistance. In Ukraine and Belarus, tens of thousands of villages were destroyed in reprisal operations or in the enforcement of the scorched earth policy. In places like Katyn, the civilian population was locked in barns and burned alive. These operations were not isolated actions, but planned procedures by regular Wehrmacht units in coordination with the SS. The mass violence also included collective executions. In September of 1941, more than 30,000 Jews were murdered in Babin Yar, a ravine near Kiev. The shooting, organized by a detachment of Einsatzgruppe C with support from the Wehrmacht, extended over several days. The victims were forced to strip before being led to the edges of the ravine and executed in successive groups. For months, that same place continued to be the site of massacres. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war reflected the same policy of extermination. Documents from the German command established that they should not receive the usual protections. Millions of captured soldiers were abandoned without food or shelter in open-air camps, and more than 3 million died from hunger, disease, or executions. These experiences profoundly marked Soviet society and the combatants themselves, who years later would advance into Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between 1942 and 1943, solidified the idea of extreme resistance against the invader. The city was reduced to ruins after months of fighting, and the Soviet recovery marked a turning point both militarily and propagandistically. The soldiers who later participated in the offensive towards Berlin had seen their families die in devastated villages, had experienced famines in frozen trenches, and had crossed territories sown with mass graves. This collective resentment was not spontaneous, but was channeled and reinforced by Soviet propaganda. Since 1942, the newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda published articles by Ilya Ehrenberg that explicitly incited killing the enemy. His texts were widely circulated among the troops in the form of pamphlets and leaflets, with phrases ordering the killing of Germans under any circumstances. Although some officers criticized the crudity of these messages, they were never censored. The official line validated that there was no difference between German soldiers and the civilian population. The propaganda insisted that the entire German people were guilty of the crimes committed in the East. The speeches on the radio and the distribution of printed materials repeated that every German family had somehow collaborated in the war machinery of the Reich. Leaflets distributed before the offensive in East Prussia claimed that there were no innocent Germans and that women and the elderly were also responsible. With this rhetoric, the boundary between combatants and civilians was deliberately erased. The result was that when the Red Army crossed into German territory in the fall of 1944, it did so convinced that it was applying a legitimate collective punishment. Summary executions of civilians, burning of villages, and violence against women began immediately in the occupied regions. The war diaries of the Soviet units recorded these events with euphemistic expressions such as acts of spontaneous justice or natural responses to fascism, which amounted to an implicit acceptance of violence as part of the military advance. Tolerance towards those behaviors was backed by the highest levels of Soviet power. In conversations with Yugoslav leader Milovan Djilas, Stalin went so far as to openly justify that soldiers had the right to have fun after so many years of fighting. This statement, which was recorded in Djilas's testimonies, reflected an official stance that dismissed treating sexual assaults as a disciplinary issue. The commanders-in-chief, such as Zhukov and Konev, were focused on the speed of their advances and the competition to be the first to reach Berlin. Discipline regarding the treatment of the civilian population was not a priority. Although some mid-level commanders attempted to impose penalties for looting and abuse, these cases were exceptional. The military courts judged a small number of soldiers, especially when the victims belonged to countries allied with the Soviet Union. In the case of German women, the trials were almost non-existent. The NKVD files record sanctions against soldiers for stealing items such as watches or bicycles, but not for sexual assaults. This difference shows that the concern of the command was limited to the looting of goods, while violence against civilians was considered a tolerated consequence of the war. Documents declassified decades later confirm that in internal reports it was acknowledged that the abuses were widespread, although it was recommended not to insist on them so as not to affect combat morale. Even prestigious marshals like Rokossovsky privately admitted that it was not possible to contain troops who had suffered the loss of their families at the hands of the German army. Statements like these demonstrate that the High Command accepted violence against civilians as an inevitable effect. The reports sent to Moscow described the abuses as isolated incidents without reflecting their massive character. A document dated May of 1945 stated that the conduct of the troops was exemplary considering the circumstances of the combat, which demonstrates the systematic minimization of the facts. The combination of accumulated hatred, revenge-oriented propaganda, and tolerance from political and military power created a context where crimes against German civilians were normalized. Soviet soldiers acted convinced that they were executing historical justice, and the absence of official sanctions consolidated that perception. Ehrenberg's speech, Stalin's statements, and the command's permissiveness turned violence into an integrated component of the offensive, without it being perceived as a deviation from the military objective. The night hunt, mass violations. After the surrender of Berlin on the 2nd of May 1945, the violence against the civilian population did not end with the silence of the weapons. The fighting was followed by a pattern of widespread abuses, including sexual assaults committed en masse by Red Army soldiers against women of all ages. The attacks took place in shelters, private homes, basements, and streets of various districts, affecting tens of thousands of victims in the first weeks of the occupation. During the nights, a repetitive dynamic was established. Groups of soldiers, often in a state of drunkenness after looting warehouses and liquor stores, would roam entire neighborhoods in search of women. The underground shelters, which had served as protection during the bombings, became common targets. The doors were forced open with blows or explosives, and once inside, the men were beaten or subdued while the women were selected to be assaulted on the spot or dragged outside. The testimonies reflect that the violence occurred openly, regardless of the presence of children, the elderly, or family members. The anonymous diary known as A Woman in Berlin, written by a journalist residing in the city, describes how groups of soldiers would break in night after night into the basements where dozens of people were sheltered. The women were repeatedly raped within a matter of hours, some up to 20 times in a few days. The author described desperate attempts to disguise their female condition by cutting their hair, covering themselves with soot, or wearing men's clothes, without managing to avoid the attacks. Hospitals recorded the immediate consequences. The Charity Complex documented an abrupt increase in patients with severe internal injuries, hemorrhages, and traumas associated with multiple sexual assaults. With reduced staff and scarce resources, doctors attended adolescents with tears requiring urgent surgery and elderly women with fatal injuries. A report from Prenzlauer Berg on the 12th of May recorded more than 30 patients in a single day, 5 of whom died in the next 48 hours. The International Red Cross gathered testimonies and observations during a visit in July of 1945. Their reports indicated that the victims in Berlin could be counted by tens of thousands, although they warned that many women did not go to medical centers out of fear, shame, or simply the inability to move around in a devastated city. The violence did not distinguish age. There were cases of girls under 14 years and elderly women attacked by groups of soldiers. A Berlin doctor recounted the death of a 72-year-old widow who died a few days later from infections resulting from the assault. Another case documented by international journalists described a 13-year-old girl who died from internal bleeding after being raped. These episodes reflect the absence of limits in the selection of victims. Repetition was another central element. Many women were attacked by several soldiers in succession and then were assaulted again on subsequent nights by other groups. This dynamic established a climate of continuous terror. Faced with the impossibility of avoiding incursions, some opted to establish forced relationships with a particular Soviet officer, seeking protection from collective attacks. The diary itself. A woman in Berlin captures the phrase, "One permanent Russian is better than half a dozen every night," reflecting that desperate survival strategy. The community shelters became especially vulnerable scenes. In Neukölln, a group of soldiers entered a basement with more than 200 people, beat the men present, and took several women to rape them in the street. In Pankow, the simultaneous assault on a mother and her teenage daughter in front of family members who could not intervene was documented. In Charlottenburg, a 55-year-old man was executed after trying to prevent a soldier from taking his young wife. Impunity was almost total. Soviet military courts sanctioned in some cases the theft of items like watches or bicycles, but there were hardly any convictions for sexual violence against German women. Only when the victims were from Allied countries, such as Poland or Czechoslovakia, were exemplary punishments handed down. In Berlin, civilians' complaints were ignored or dismissed by the occupying patrols. The figures concerning the magnitude of these assaults remain a subject of historiographical debate, but research based on medical records and testimonies estimates that in Berlin, at least 100,000 women were raped during the spring and summer of 1945. Other studies raise that figure to 130,000 or more, considering the large number of unreported cases. Nationally, calculations by historians like Norman Naimark place the total at several million victims in Germany and nearby territories occupied by the Red Army. Violence immediately affected daily life. Many women remained hidden for several days in shelters, further complicating the search for food and medicine. Those who went out to look for supplies did it in groups during daylight hours and completely avoiding the streets after nightfall. Families organized nighttime surveillance systems at the entrances of basements, trusting that teenagers or elderly people could negotiate or give warning in case of incursions. However, these measures rarely succeeded, and frequently those who tried to resist were executed. The documents collected by Berlin doctors include testimonies from devastated parents and husbands after trying to protect their daughters or wives. These events show that sexual violence was also a mechanism of public domination committed in front of entire communities. These were not isolated acts, but visible collective practices that made sexual fear a daily component of the occupation. The massive consumption of alcohol intensified the phenomenon. Wineries and distilleries were looted immediately after the fall of the city. The nights became the most dangerous times, with drunken soldiers roaming the streets and basements. The term hunting hours was etched into the memory of Berliners to describe the period between sunset and early morning when military groups burst in seeking victims. Families took refuge in absolute silence, but the soldiers' methodical search made it impossible to avoid contact. During May and June, the frequency of attacks decreased as a certain administrative structure became consolidated, but in many districts, violence remained a part of daily life. For Berlin communities, the official end of the war did not mean the return to safety, but the beginning of a new stage marked by nightly fear and permanent vulnerability. Desecrated places, altars toppled under violence. In the spring of 1945, the city of Berlin was reduced to a field of ruins. Every building that remained standing became a potential refuge for the civilian population. Institutions traditionally considered protected spaces, such as hospitals, churches, and schools, were occupied by thousands of Berliners seeking to escape the fighting and the Soviet advance. However, instead of offering safety, many of these places were transformed into scenes of looting, violence, and sexual abuses committed by the occupying troops. The hospitals were already in collapse before the arrival of the Red Army. Weeks of bombardments had saturated the facilities with war-wounded civilians trapped in collapses and victims of air attacks. After the 2nd of May, the situation worsened with the massive arrival of women who had suffered sexual assaults. The University Hospital of the Charité, the largest in the capital, recorded a dramatic increase in patients with internal injuries, multiple fractures, and severe traumas. The doctors lacked anesthesia, antibiotics, and surgical material, which caused many to die a few hours after their admission. Dr. Walter von Baer described the daily arrival of teenagers and older women with wounds he deemed irreparable in his medical notes. His records mention internal tears so severe that they required reconstructive surgeries that were impossible under the existing conditions. Healthcare staff were also not protected by their function. Nurses were attacked in the hospitals themselves, as happened in Prenzlauer Berg, where soldiers broke in at dawn, beat up patients who tried to intervene, and raped 4 nurses in adjoining rooms. Similar situations were repeated in Moabit and Friedrichshain, where doctors and surgeons were forced to witness abuses without being able to prevent them. Internal reports from these hospitals show that during the first fortnight of May, more than half of the female admissions were related to sexual violence. Doctors had to combine the treatment of war wounds with venereal infections, forced pregnancies, and severe trauma. Catholic and Protestant convents, which had opened their doors to welcome refugees, were also targeted in raids. In Pankow, soldiers stormed into a convent with more than 40 civilian and religious women, beat those present, and raped them indiscriminately. Parish testimonies describe the destruction of altars, the desecration of liturgical objects, and the consumption of communion wine before the assaults. In Neukölln, a similar attack against a female convent was documented. The soldiers destroyed crucifixes and attacked the nuns in the chapel itself. Even elderly women were victims. A nun of 65 years recounted having been raped along with 3 companions, while in Lankwitz, several nuns contracted syphilis and died months later without treatment. In other cases, nuns who survived committed suicide days later, unable to face the aftermath. These events show that neither age nor religious status offered protection. The churches, used as improvised shelters during the fighting, were equally desecrated. In Charlottenburg, a church that housed more than 200 people was raided on the night of the 3rd of May. Several women were separated from their families and raped at the main altar, while the soldiers destroyed religious images and used the pews as barricades. In Mitte, a Lutheran pastor recorded in his diary that 2 women sheltered in his parish were sexually assaulted and died days later from infections. Chalices, crosses, and liturgical ornaments were looted as spoils, and confessionals came to be used as places to commit assaults. Religious symbolism, far from stopping the abuses, was subject to deliberate destruction. Soldiers broke altars with axes, tore pages from Bibles to light fires, and drank sacramental alcohol while committing rapes. The sacredness of the temples was completely annulled under the logic of military occupation. The schools, closed for several weeks, were also occupied by entire families who considered them to be relatively safe shelters from bombings. The classrooms were transformed into improvised collective dormitories. However, these concentrations of civilians became raid targets. In Friedrichshain, a group of students aged 15 to 17 was attacked for 3 consecutive nights. The young women were raped in hallways and classrooms, while the teachers remained under armed threat. In Lichtenberg, a school gymnasium used as a shelter was the scene of an attack in which soldiers separated all women under 40 years old and assaulted them in adjacent rooms, while elderly and children remained detained in the courtyard. The teachers were not respected for their educational role either. In Moabit, female teachers who were in charge of evacuated students were attacked inside the classrooms in the presence of their pupils. The St. Hedwig Hospital, run by nuns, suffered an especially severe incident when soldiers burst into maternity wards. Women who had just given birth were raped in their beds, and several died due to postpartum hemorrhages exacerbated by the assaults. The newborns were left unattended for hours, and some died due to lack of care. In Prenzlauer Berg, a school converted into a field hospital was invaded by troops who raped both patients and volunteers. The overcrowding and the presence of seriously wounded did not prevent the abuses. These episodes demonstrate that no institutional function, health, religious, or educational, offered protection. The contrast between the nature of these institutions and the violence they were subjected to highlights the magnitude of the moral and normative collapse. Hospitals, intended to heal, were transformed into places of death for patients and staff. Convents, symbols of spiritual refuge, were looted and their nuns outraged. Churches, traditionally inviolable, became scenes of violation and symbolic destruction. Schools, spaces of protection for childhood, were used to attack students and teachers. The systematic desecration of these institutions was not an isolated accident nor the result of individual excesses. It was part of the same pattern of violence observed in homes, shelters, and streets of Berlin. The difference lay in that the attack on these traditionally protected places made the complete absence of limits in the conduct of the occupation troops more visible. After the surrender, Berlin sunken in disease and suicide. The entry of the Red Army into Berlin marked the beginning of a distinct phase of suffering for the civilian population. Material destruction and direct violence were followed by medical and social consequences that transformed the city into a scene of humanitarian emergency. The collapse of the health system, the spread of venereal diseases, and a wave of mass suicides marked the months following the capitulation. The Berlin hospitals, already overwhelmed after years of bombings and weeks of urban combat, could not absorb the sudden influx of women needing care after sexual assaults. The wards, designed to attend to war injuries, were filled with patients suffering from internal lacerations, hemorrhages, and multiple traumas. The shortage of medication exacerbated the situation. German pharmaceutical production had collapsed, and penicillin was practically non-existent. Doctors worked with obsolete sulfonamides, unable to stop infections that under normal conditions would have been treatable. La Charité and other hospitals documented regular deaths from sepsis stemming from injuries and complicated births. Dr. Walter von Bayer noted the constant arrival of teenagers and older women with wounds he described as irreparable, impossible to treat without adequate means. In makeshift hospitals, overcrowding favored cross-contamination among injured patients, tuberculosis sufferers, and women with infections resulting from rapes. The absence of antibiotics favored the spread of venereal diseases on an epidemic scale. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread rapidly. A municipal health report from November of 1945 indicated that up to 15% of the women attended showed compatible symptoms, although the real figure was probably higher, as many avoided going to the centers for fear of stigma or due to the impossibility of traveling in a devastated city. The hospitals of Moabit, Friedrichshain, and the Charité received dozens of women each day with primary syphilis or complicated gonorrhea. In the absence of penicillin, doctors resorted to treatments with mercury or bismuth salts, with severe side effects and limited effectiveness. The results were discouraging: chronic infections, sterility, skin lesions, and neurosyphilis in advanced stages. Observers from the International Red Cross confirmed the magnitude of this epidemic during their inspections in the summer, describing entire wards filled with young patients with persistent fever, abdominal pain, and genital ulcers. A dramatic increase in forced pregnancies added to this crisis. Numerous women sought to terminate them through clandestine abortions. The lack of available doctors and safe resources led to the practice of home procedures with sharp objects, chemicals, or herbal mixtures of uncertain effectiveness. Failed attempts caused uncontrollable bleeding and fatal septicemia. A report by occupation authorities in 1946 estimated that more than 1/5 of hospital female deaths in the following months were directly or indirectly linked to rapes, bleeding, infections, unsafe abortions, or obstetric complications. The psychological and social impact was reflected in an unprecedented wave of suicides. Between April and June of 1945, the fragmentary records of the police and parishes placed the figure at least 10,000. Subsequent investigations, such as those by historian Helke Sander, raised the estimates to 15,000 in the capital alone during those months. The motivations appear in farewell notes and testimonies: inability to endure humiliation, fear of further assaults, and stigmatization by the community. The recorded cases illustrate the magnitude. In Wedding, a 32-year-old woman hanged herself after being raped in front of her children, leaving a note of apology. In Moabit, 2 teenage sisters threw themselves from a ruined building after consecutive nights of abuse. In Neukölln, the occupation authorities were collecting bodies almost daily from the Landwehr Canal. In Charlottenburg, a mother and her teenage daughter committed suicide together in their home. In Pankow, a 70-year-old woman ingested rat poison after being attacked the previous night. Hospitals also became places of suicide. In Charlottenburg, a doctor recorded the case of a young woman of 18 years who, after learning that she was pregnant as a result of a gang rape, threw herself from a window of the hospital where she was admitted. In Friedrichshain and Prenzlauer Berg, collective suicides of women unable to cope with the aftermath of the abuse were documented. The methods reflected desperation and precariousness: hangings with sheets or belts, ingestion of cleaning products or pesticides, jumps from ruined buildings. These patterns were repeated in all the districts, becoming a massive phenomenon in a matter of weeks. The makeshift centers in schools, basements, and shelters were also witnesses to the tragedy. In Prenzlauer Berg, a school converted into an emergency hospital attended to tens of women in critical condition. Without resources, the doctors could barely offer painkillers and improvised bandages. Several died in a few hours from lack of adequate surgery. In Lichtenberg, a shelter converted into a clinic received patients with venereal diseases without possibility of treatment, described by a health worker as a depot of sick women where mortality was constant. The deterioration of living conditions worsened the situation. Many women refused to leave their shelters for fear of new attacks, which increased hunger and lack of access to care. Social shame and community rejection deepened the isolation. Records from Lutheran parishes show cases of women rejected by their own religious communities considered contaminated after the assaults. This stigma, along with physical violence and the absence of support, increased the number of suicides. The sum of infections, forced pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and mass suicides turned the military defeat into a human collapse that spread for months after the end of the war. Berlin went from being a scene of combat to becoming a space where disease, self-inflicted death, and isolation marked the daily life of tens of thousands of people. So, the impunity of the victor, Soviet silence, and complicity. After the capitulation of Berlin, the magnitude of the abuses committed by the Red Army forced some Soviet officers to try to impose disciplinary measures. However, these attempts were exceptional and lacked continuity. Most of the commanders chose to ignore the violence, directly participate in it, or tolerate it as a natural part of the occupation. Stalin's statements and the systematic censorship of reports sent to Moscow consolidated a climate of impunity that ensured that millions of crimes went unpunished. In some districts, isolated punishments were recorded. In Köpenick, an artillery captain expressly forbade his men from attacking civilians and sent 2 soldiers caught attempting rape to forced labor. In Charlottenburg, a colonel ordered the execution of 3 soldiers accused of murdering an elderly man during a looting. Although these cases were documented, they had a marginal impact. The vast majority of units operated without strict disciplinary supervision. In practice, the conduct of the troops depended on the attitude of their immediate commanders. The majority showed indifference. In internal reports, rapes and lootings were described with euphemisms such as inevitable incidents or excesses. The Russian term izlishestvo was used to minimize the magnitude of the crimes. In neighborhoods like Pankow and Lichtenberg, local commanders allowed nighttime raids without intervening. Testimonies collected after the war recount that some officers selected young women for personal use and handed over the rest of the captives to their subordinates as a form of reward. Complicity spread throughout the hierarchy. Lieutenants and captains who had the ability to impose discipline ignored the abuses or participated in them. While a few imposed exemplary punishments, the norm was tolerance or direct participation. Military archives preserve abundant records of sanctions for desertion or insubordination, but barely any mentions appear of punishments for sexual violence against the German population. The permissiveness was backed by the highest authorities. In April of 1945, Stalin told Milovan Djilas that a soldier who had traveled thousands of kilometers of combat had the right to have fun with a woman or take a trinket. This statement reflected that sexual violence was not seen as a disciplinary issue, but as a natural consequence of war. The declaration nullified any possibility of systematic control measures. Other leaders shared this vision. Rokossovsky privately admitted that it was impossible and counterproductive to restrain troops who had seen their families die under German occupation. Zhukov, the main commander during the Battle of Berlin, never mentioned the mass rapes in his memoirs, an omission that reflected the deliberate policy of silence. The absence of public condemnation was understood by the soldiers as tacit approval. The reports sent to Moscow were manipulated to hide the magnitude of the crimes. Declassified documents in the 1990s show that the rapes and looting were described as isolated cases of inappropriate behavior. A report submitted to the NKVD in May of 1945 acknowledged some acts of indiscipline but avoided figures and details. The more precise internal complaints were corrected with explicit instructions not to harm the morale of the army. The Soviet press reinforced this silence. Military publications such as Krasnaya Zvezda and civilian newspapers like Pravda presented the Red Army as a heroic liberator without mentioning abuses. Correspondents were ordered to focus on the destruction of Nazi symbols and the liberation of Soviet prisoners, omitting any reference to violence against civilians. Unlike what happened in the Western occupation zones, where military courts sentenced some soldiers for crimes against civilians, in the Soviet case there is no record of systematic prosecutions for rapes in Germany. In Berlin, no records have been found of military courts that tried soldiers for abuses against German women. The few documented punishments were isolated summary executions, and almost always when the victims were citizens of Allied countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia. The German population clearly perceived the difference. While women from nations considered friends could receive some protection, German women were treated as part of the spoils of war. This distinction reflected a logic of collective punishment. German women did not deserve protection because they belonged to the aggressor nation. Impunity was absolute. No high-ranking Soviet commander was held accountable for the crimes committed under their command, neither during the war nor in the subsequent decades. The lack of judicial proceedings consolidated an institutional silence that was maintained throughout the Cold War. In the official Soviet narrative, the abuses did not exist. The violence exerted against German civilians was deliberately omitted and presented as hostile propaganda if it appeared in Western media. The occupation of Berlin was recorded as a heroic victory that liberated Europe from fascism, with no room to acknowledge the German civilian victims.